Hi, and welcome to Kay Let's Talk, the podcast where we break down storytelling across books, television, and film with a special love for book-to-screen adaptations. Here, we talk about craft, character arcs, structure, dialogue, visual language, and the creative choices that shape how a story lands. If you like thoughtful conversational deep dives into the stories you can't stop thinking about, you're in the right place. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast. I can't wait to dive into this week's episode because I got this request from someone in my DMs to talk about Shane Hollander's Heroes arc. And this was brought up because Rachel Reid, the author herself, has said that the grand story, the overarching story, is actually Shane's story and his hero's journey. As soon as she said that, I knew I wanted to cover this, and then someone very kindly asked me if I would, and twist my arm. I'm happy to talk about it. So that's what we're going to talk about in this week's podcast episode. I've written down so many notes. I can't wait to go through them all. This is, of course, my opinion. I would love to hear everybody else's. I think that this is such a wonderful storytelling vehicle for her to use, and for her to explicitly state that she is trying to write it this way makes me so excited. And it's very easy to see and map out if you have that context when reading through Heated Rivalry, The Long Game, and then anticipating Unrivaled, which is going to be the third book for Shane and Ilya. So, of course, this will have spoilers for The Long Game if you have not read that book yet, and then speculation for Unrivaled. So if you are looking to avoid any of those things, please make sure that you skip this episode or come back to it when you have read The Long Game. So without further ado, let's talk about Shane Hollander's Heroes arc. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to just clarify what exactly a hero's arc or hero's journey is. There's also another name for it called the monomyth. There's a lot of history surrounding that I think is really worth digging into if storytelling or the construction of stories is something that you are interested in. It's essentially a complete template or like a broad trajectory used to tell tales that involve a hero that goes on an adventure, has a crisis, wins in a fight, comes out with victory, and then returns home a changed and transformed hero. A man named Joseph Campbell is credited for this. The whole outline of the monomyth or the hero's journey is also based on a practical guide to Joseph Campbell's The Hero with 1,000 Faces. So again, if you want to do your own research, it's very interesting to read up on that. There's a diagram as well to help explain what the adventure for the hero in the story looks like. And the whole thing is comprised of a few different pillars that outline the general story. They can also be broken into 3 acts. The first act is called the departure. Within the departure, or within Act 1, there are a number of key bullet points listed for the main character or the hero to go through to initiate the story. The first being introducing the ordinary world, which is the world that the hero currently exists within, so that we can identify what is going on with that character, how they live, how they navigate the world, what their moral high ground is, what their principles are, and really establish the baseline that we're going to be starting off with in the story. The second pillar is the call to adventure, which is when the hero is presented with some sort of a problem or a challenge or a call to adventure, a quest of some sort. That often introduces other characters that the hero is going to be interacting with, of course, but it also brings up the third bullet point, which is a refusal of the call. So the hero often will hesitate or initially refuse to accept this journey because they have preemptive fears that are largely stemming from the very normal, comfortable life that they're used to living, and this adventure disrupts. The fourth pillar is when the hero meets with some sort of a mentor. So someone who's been on this journey or is also going on this journey. It's identified as a seasoned traveler that gives the hero training, equipment, confidence. This can be metaphorical as well. And then the fifth bullet point in Act 1 is crossing the first threshold. So the hero fully committing to going on this journey, taking place in this heroic quest, And then the hero is able to enter into this new world that they're exposed to that is often special or dangerous. And again, those can be metaphors as well. That then brings us into Act 2, which is categorized as the initiation for the hero. So the first bullet point of Act 2, and there are 4 bullet points, is tests, allies, and enemies. And so the hero of the story learns all the new rules of this new world that they're entering into through a series of challenges, also coming across allies and enemies. And again, that strengthens the story by introducing more characters, and those characters often help guide the hero through these challenges or difficulties so that there are lessons learned during this initiation period. The bullet point after that is called the approach to the inmost cave, which is one of my favorites. It's when the hero is dealing with the central crisis of the story. So oftentimes this will be a larger dramatic moment that the hero is facing, and they have to retreat inwards and find their own strength within themselves. They can't be relying so much on allies. They have to then use what they've learned over the course of time to get themselves out of this crisis. The next bullet point is called the ordeal, which is when the hero faces the greatest fear that they have or has a death and rebirth type experience. The way that they were navigating the world is no longer logical for them. They can no longer continue on in the ways that they had previously been. There is a death of sorts of the old self and a rebirth into this new, fully actualized version of the hero. And they can only do that by facing what was their greatest fear that we were establishing early on in the story. The fourth bullet point in Act 2 is called reward, or when the hero is seizing the sword. So the hero then survives this ordeal and gains a reward. That can be an object, that can be knowledge, that can be power, that can be a relationship, that can be a number of things. But seizing the sword is coming into their own power, grasping at the greatness that has always existed within them, but they had to go through these trials and tribulations in order to find and achieve. That then brings us into Act 3, which is called the return. This act has only 3 bullet points within it. The first one is called the road back. So the hero is attempting now, after seizing their reward, to return to the world they came from, their ordinary world. And oftentimes they have remaining dangers or unresolved conflicts following them back to that ordinary world. That leads them to the next bullet point, which is the resurrection. This is the final highest stakes battle that the hero is going to face. And through this battle, the hero is often described as being purified and transformed fully. So this is when they reach their pinnacle self, the highest version of themselves. And then the final bullet point in the return is called return with the elixir. So the hero finally returns home using the reward that they have gained in order to improve the ordinary world that they started off in, that they are returning home to. So a full circle moment where they return to where we met them, fully transformed and changed by this hero's journey, hero's arc that they have gone on. Hopefully, after I've read through all of those bullet points, you can identify and start thinking of some moments in the storytelling that we've already seen and can align with these big moments within this hero's journey, this hero's arc. I've mapped out what I feel are moments that align with these bullet points and each act within this hero's journey, this monomyth. And so I'm going to go through all of them in order. And again, I'd love to hear everybody's 2 cents, and if there's other moments that you think fit into specific moments or bullet points here, because I think it's a really great exercise if you're someone who's writing a story yourself, to be able to see all the different ways in which you can accomplish these things without it being too on the nose. We're not fighting dragons in this story. This is very much a personal hero's journey for this character, so much so that I think a lot of people didn't recognize that that's what was happening in this story until Rachel herself pointed it out. To me, Shane's hero's journey is largely internal, and his quest isn't actually about hockey. It's more so about his identity outside of hockey, the relationship he has with control, and his journey is actually him finding vulnerability and being able to be in partnership with someone who he loves. Ilya serves as this emotional heart of the overarching story, but he's also the overarching emotional heart of Shane's story too. It's not because Ilya leads Shane into this hero's journey that his transformation happens, so to speak. It's more so because he's the reason Shane can no longer stay in this ordinary world he exists in. Ilya presents something that makes him dream bigger and look outside of the norm and this box that he's put himself inside. So the first bullet point of Act 1 is the ordinary world, and that's where we meet Shane. When he is a very young kid, he's only 17, 18, he's very disciplined, hyper-controlled, emotionally guarded, and very young. The key difference being that for him, his ordinary world is the NHL, or in the show, it's the MLH, which is not ordinary at all. It's very singular. Because of that, he's become a person defined by his precision, his routine, the very carefully constructed image that he and Una, his mother, have made for him. And as a person of color who must be extraordinary and flawless and undeniable, he's also carrying this expectation to be an example for young kids who look like him. So he's coming into this quote unquote ordinary world with a very specific story intact. So that's what also I feel makes this story in particular so fascinating, is because Shane and Ilya are both very specific characters with very specific traits and backgrounds and a storyline that is incredibly unique to only them. Buried beneath the weight of everything else that Shane is dealing with is his closeted identity that he's not allowed himself to explore or even entertain. And so by suppressing his desires, it's quietly costing him, and he does not realize how much it's costing him until he meets Ilya. That's when we reach this call to adventure state. And Ilya Rozanov is both the call to adventure, but also he represents the destabilization of Shane's very carefully constructed world. And he makes this version of Shane that we meet at the beginning of the story essentially unsustainable. So Ilya, to me, is the inciting force here. And he disrupts Shane's very carefully constructed world, not just because of Shane's attraction to him, but because Ilya represents something that Shane cannot neatly categorize or suppress within himself. And so his call, it isn't a moment in particular. It's not the water bottle, that sort of moment. I would just say it's more Ilya himself. And their rivalry serves as the framework that Shane disguises his unnerving feelings behind. But love sits really close to hatred. And so he battles with his feelings internally for years. And what makes this compelling is that his call to adventure, it isn't something Shane initially wants. It's actually something he spends years actively resisting and trying to deny himself, which fits so neatly into the refusal to the call. So after Ilya and Shane cross paths and it creates this initial call to adventure, Shane's journey continues with his refusal to the call. And so in the story, it's spread out over years of Shane resisting Ilya's approaches. And Shane goes to great lengths to keep their relationship secret and compartmentalize it in his own mind and control as much of the situation and the narrative around them as possible. And all of that stems from his fear of being gay, of wanting Ilya, of disappointing his parents, of losing his career, his fear of being loved. He's afraid of that. And Ilya, again, embodies what Shane wants, but believes he can't have. Ilya has this openness. He has this supposed emotional freedom, and he lives this life that is seemingly not dictated by fear. And so through their relationship, it's very intense and secret and cyclical. It just keeps pulling Shane back in, even when he's trying to find distance or maintain it. That leads into the meeting with the mentor side of the hero's journey. And in the traditional sense, I would say that Shane meets a mentor in the TV series in Scott Hunter. They've put him in that sort of mentor role. He's much more prominent in the show than he is in the book, and his appearances are strategically placed at certain moments in his hero's journey of resisting the call or refusing the call. And he serves as kind of a steady encouragement for Shane. But in most ways, you can argue that the mentor is Ilya, because he is a mirror held up to Shane, showing him what he lacks and what he's afraid of becoming. Ilya doesn't guide Shane in a clean, wise, mentor-like way that we often see depicted. He pushes him, though, sometimes very messily, towards being honest. He's always pushing him towards honesty. And he challenges Shane's boundaries and calls out his avoidance and refuses to let their relationship stay superficial. Even though the two of them are forced into hiding it within their bubble, Ilya is the one that makes Shane feel brave, and he presses the issue. And he does that unconsciously at times, but also consciously too. And all of that leads to the moment where we cross the first threshold, which is when in the hero's journey, the hero fully commits to join the dangerous, special world being offered to him, this journey being presented. And in the storyline, I see this as when he and Ilya decide to become a couple and they're in a committed relationship. And that's by the end of Heated Rivalry and into the beginning of the long game. But it starts with it being accepted at the end of Heated Rivalry. What makes that interesting is that by the end of the first book, they are technically coming up with a plan for how they will be together, but it is still one where Shane is deeply rooted in his pre-existing fears from that ordinary world that we established at the top of the story. So you can still see how, even though he's made this decision, he's theoretically keeping one foot in that old world. He has not yet gone through any of those trials and tribulations that he needs to in order to level up and evolve into the true hero that he is destined to become. And that's where we meet him in the long game. So as we continue this crossing of the first threshold, we meet Shane and Ilya in the long game, and they are in a committed relationship, but it's still secret. And they've come up with their plan. They've set things in motion. They have taken the steps across that threshold together and decided that they will be together, and they'll figure out what that looks like against all odds. But unfortunately, that moment of bliss and that honeymoon phase is very short-lived because they still don't know how to communicate with one another. Shane is still very committed to the plan because it feeds into his need for control. And again, that's an archetype of his that is deeply rooted in his world, his ordinary world that he starts out in. And his fear of being discovered has not gone away. Whereas Ilya is not entirely on the same page about that and finds it much harder to deal with the realities of their relationship given his isolation and depression. So Shane may have taken all of the steps to map out their future, establish the rules, set them up to be together one day, but in reality, the relationship, it's more than just the choice to be in one. It still requires sacrifice, and Shane is still faced with a number of internal battles that he must identify within himself, then face, and then resolve, which perfectly leads to the next phase, which is tests, allies, and enemies. So within Shane and Ilya's relationship, we as readers can start to detect patterns and cracks. And one of those is the distance between the two of them due to their careers and how that has started to manifest into more challenges between them and therefore arguments between them. And as Ilya's depression grows and he starts to identify that he is depressed, he ends up shutting Shane out. And Shane, transversely, does not push Ilya to share his emotions. And so more misunderstandings start to rear their ugly head. Shane's expectations of himself, his career, and his own internalized fears, they make Ilya feel unimportant and angry and isolated. And ultimately that makes him slightly resentful because they cannot love each other in the way that he wants to love Shane because of Shane's internal roadblocks. And so Shane's attempt to keep his emotions together and be strong for Ilya actually leads him to largely blind himself to what Ilya has actually sacrificed for him and for their relationship already. And so their fight is the pinnacle of this. That's when they are able to identify that the enemy is largely the League, yes, but it's also themselves if they're not able to find a way to converse with one another in a healthy way. This means that Shane starts to approach the innermost cave. So again, in the aftermath of their fight, we see him retreat, and that growing impossibility of sustaining both his public life and his private truth, brought on by this fight after Christmas, and ultimately the plane scare scene, are what forced Shane to enter into his innermost cave and confront himself directly. And the irony here is that all throughout the story, Shane's growth doesn't happen in isolation. It happens because Ilya makes his old life unbearable. It makes the status quo unbearable. Without Ilya, Shane could have remained comfortably stuck there forever because he would have been too nervous to step outside the lines. But being with Ilya means that he is afraid of staying the same. It starts to feel like a loss to him to stay in that place and live in that fear. And so Ilya's love and making Ilya feel loved become more important to Shane than what was previously his comfort, which is control and safety and privacy and keeping that part of himself hidden. He goes into this innermost world and realizes that he's willing to sacrifice his own comfort and control in order to be with the man he loves. And it takes him being threatened with the concept that he wouldn't be able to mourn Ilya should something have happened to him on that airplane, and he would have spent the rest of his life slowly dying in grief alone, for him to realize what's actually important to him now. And the things that he was placing so high on a pedestal and making important are actually not as important as that fact. That's when we reach the ordeal. And this represents an emotional breaking point of the hero on their journey. And all of Shane's come when his love for Ilya demand that he finally be honest, both with himself and other people around him. And at a certain point, Ilya is not just part of the journey for Shane, but can actually be categorized as one of those tests, because loving Ilya requires Shane to confront everything he's built his identity around, which again is his need for control, his desperate desire for privacy, for perfection, his very polished reputation. Ilya's very existence directly affects each of those pillars of Shane's personality. And so once he and Ilya are together and they fall in love, Shane's personality shifts and it is able to transform into a version that Shane feels is actually more in alignment with his true self. And he would have never been able to discover that if not for Ilya. And not this repressed, rigid, sad, lost person that we find him as at the beginning of the story and that he'd grown comfortable being. And so the one priority of Shane's at this point, when Ilya is at his lowest, is to not only be a partner worthy of someone like Ilya, but also making Ilya feel like he's worthy of Shane moving mountains for him. And so when the two of them get engaged, this is yet another step in the direction they both wish to move in, which is building a life together and having it be out in the open at some point in the near future. So it's both the reward in the story, yes, but it's also, in my mind, an ordeal, because now they must navigate what being engaged looks like and not being able to tell anyone. And then they start to slowly tell some people, and that is when they are outed. And this to me is the ultimate ordeal, because their relationship is exposed without their consent or in a way that they chose for themselves. And so they have all of these additional pressures from each of their teams, the reactions from their teammates, and we see the very contrasting way in which Ilya is received by his own team, despite this deeper dilemma within Shane, which ultimately, again, is what the ordeal looks like here. Because by that point, the real question is whether Shane is willing to lose the life he understands within his team in Montreal in order to live a truthful one with Ilya. And he really struggles with that for a while in the book. That's when we reach the reward or seizing the sword moment of the story. And to me, Shane and Ilya's decision to confront the commissioner, announce their relationship, share their engagement, hold their wedding in their backyard, and ultimately Shane's departure from Montreal, they're all part of that reward. To me, Shane is seizing the sword within his own life and within his relationship with Ilya every time they go through each of those story beats. And so I think it's important to almost separate those two things, because yes, Ilya is Shane's whole world, but Shane as a person and as a character is his own man. And so he needed to learn to make decisions about his own life for himself first and for no one else. And so in this hero's journey and in this phase of the hero's journey, he's become someone who puts his own needs and desires first, whereas previously it was last in every facet of his life. So by the end of the long game, we're finally starting to see what it looks like when Shane is self-assured and confident. And yes, he's terrified, but he's willing to be brave now. And that bravery allows him to choose his own destiny. That doesn't happen if Shane hadn't done the work and confronted his fears and dealt with a lot of his own hang-ups and biases so that he's able to operate from a place of self-assuredness and more of like an internal peace that he's never had before. And it's something we've never seen in Shane before now. And so when he and Ilya step out onto the ice together at the end of the book, it's a new version of Shane who is about to be tested in new ways. But he's a almost fully actualized person by this point because of the journey he's gone on so far. But going into this next phase of their story together, he's never not been a captain. He's never not been on a cup contending team or any other team besides Montreal since his rookie year, for that matter. And he's never been in a locker room with Ilya. He's never traveled on the road with him. He's never prepared for a game with him. He's never spent every moment of every day with him. What does that look like? What does that do to the stakes of their relationship again? It is going to rearrange those trials and tribulations that he has to go through in order to come out of this hero's journey fully actualized at the end of this 3-book overarching storyline. So that's where we're leaving Shane at the end of the long game. And when we think about Unrivaled and what we can deduce from it so far, there are, again, 3 bullet points that have to be covered in this 3rd book. The first being the road back. So while there, of course, will be obstacles for Shane to face in Unrivaled, including this supposed big bad in the form of a hockey podcast, Shane's biggest obstacle isn't always going to be something external. It's often himself. And so he has this fear of losing control, of risking everything he's built. That's always the true test for him in his story. And protecting him and Ilya from the outside forces is part of that, certainly, but he maintains much of his fear that stems from this internal restraint well into the long game, and I suspect that will still be there in Unrivaled as well. In the portion of his journey that takes place in the road back, Shane will now have to figure out what his new normal is while living a life that he long thought was entirely and completely impossible because he's now married, playing in the MLH, publicly out, sharing a locker room and teammates with Ilya, and Ilya is his captain. And he's in a new city, learning a new system, and still dealing with the repercussions and hurt of needing to leave his old team in Montreal. And so this, again, will come with its own set of challenges. And all of this is without even considering the possibility of something that Ilya might be grappling with in Unrivaled that becomes a challenge for Shane by proxy. The next pillar is the resurrection, which is the final battle where our hero is finally fully transformed. And so again, I imagine this is going to be a moment when Shane defends himself and Ilya from the protagonist of the book, which I suspect is going to be the podcast, yes, but also fans, society, the league. Often this resurrection is done in a very grand and triumphant gesture in order to prove that he's no longer the character we meet at the beginning of his hero's journey. And he's no longer afraid to put himself directly in the line of fire in order to do what he feels is right and what is best for himself and for Ilya. This, I think, is also going to trickle down to mean that he will defend anyone within the community that he is now a part of, because in the long game, specifically when he and Ilya start going on double dates with Ryan Price and his boyfriend Fabian, Shane expresses that he's never fully explored what it means to be gay, what that means to him, and how he fits into that community. He isn't sure how he's going to fit into that community or if he fits into it. And I suspect that that will be part of his journey in Unrivaled as well, because it would culminate quite nicely here. That also leads us into the final phase of the hero's journey, which is the return with the elixir. And again, that's when the hero returns home, changed and in possession of his reward, ready to return to his normal life and the world he came from, but move forward in a way where he can integrate both his new identity and all of the new lessons that he's learned. If Shane's initial difficulty was himself, then the resolution here would be his ability to love himself and accept himself fully. And so a large part of that is the gift of Ilya's love and their relationship, but I also suspect that this is when we will see the fruits of Ilya's labor as well, because they've built a community together, not only within their foundation, the Arena Foundation, but for players within the league who also identify as queer. And so that brings them both a true level of fulfillment that I think rivals that of their hockey careers and all of their accomplishments thus far. And to me, I would assume that that sense of purpose would free both of them of so much pain and trauma from their formative years, and it would give them hope for change and also a renewed sense of purpose as they move closer to retirement. And I also suspect that the two of them wanting to have children would also provide them with that sense of purpose as well. So the two of them are building a life outside of the sport that has defined them since their childhoods. They're going to need to find a new world to walk into. And that is exactly what the end of this hero's journey calls for. And for so long with Shane especially, he could not tell where he began and hockey ended. It was so intrinsically part of himself and defined him so deeply. And that aspect of his life really ruled all of his decision-making. It had such rigid constructs and biases that became part of his personality. And now Shane has a life outside of hockey that he has chosen, which in and of itself is the reward. So that's how I am guessing the hero's journey for Shane is going to end. But again, Rachel Reid is going to include so many moments and nuance that I could never predict. But I do feel like when you lay it out in this way, it is very clear that Shane is on this beautiful hero's journey, and the story is very much about him. Even though, again, his battles are not external in the same way that I think Ilya's character can make them. You know, he has his brother and his father. Shane's is very close to the chest. He's fighting with things in his head, and because we're reading a book and we can live inside of his head, it helps make that clearer. I think it's a great example of how you can write a character in this way and give him this heroic journey without it being the traditional one. And the internal battles we all fight are just as valid and worth exploring as the external ones. So please let me know if you've thought about Shane's hero's journey, his monomyth, if you've ever looked into this style of storytelling structure before. There are so many stories and movies and shows that if you look for it, you can find this within. It's been around for a very long time. It's here to stay. And I think it's fun to deconstruct a story and look at it so closely and see how there are so many different ways that you can take this framework and use it to tell a really interesting and compelling story about a person transforming and leveling up and growing. So I hope you enjoyed my gabbing about Shane's hero's arc and explanation as to what that is. Please let me know if there are any moments that you think fit neatly into one of these categories in Act 1, Act 2, or Act 3, and then the subcategories within each of them. I think that it's fun to take scenes and kind of plug them in now that we know that they're all part of that hero's journey that Shane's on and that will be culminating in Unrivaled, which I'm really excited to see how she wraps it up, given what I think those last 3 story beats that she's going to be covering are. As always, if you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And again, keep sending me your thoughts and questions in the DMs. I get so much inspiration talking to people about this show and the writing and storytelling and how wonderful it's been executed for our screens. And it leads to great, insightful, thoughtful questions like this that we get to discuss on the podcast. So keep them coming. I absolutely love them. Thank you again, and I will talk to you guys in our next chat.